The following program aired on KMFO Radio in Santa Cruz, California on November 8, 1984. You will hear Mae Brussell refer to a Smithsonian Magazine article on the Knights of Malta. Mae misspoke when she gave the date of that issue. She meant to say January of 1983, not June of '83.
KMFO Talk Radio presents Forum, a look at topics and issues of interest around the Monterey Bay Area. Today's Forum meets with Mae Brussell. Now, here's our host of today's Forum, John Arnold.
To the effect of what's happening to us. Are you reading me? Okay. What I'm really trying to say is we're talking about the Knights of Malta, who have worldwide ambitions, but today we're going to look at their position against our democratic form of government and what they have in mind. The last election, just elected by a landslide, Mr. Ronald Reagan for re-election, even though his platform was anti-abortion, school prayer, and what you might call traditional values, which always reminds me of something like Philadelphia's Blue Laws, where you couldn't finish a baseball game that was started if it went past 6:45 in the evening for fear you might miss Vespers. Mae, what are the Knights of Malta exactly?
Okay, before we get on Knights of Malta, I want to say that this is not, for people listening, an anti-Catholic position, because there are many believing Catholics who do not even become familiar with this except in some strange way they believe it's a private club. The Sovereign Military Knights of Malta, SMOM, began in the year 1000. Actually, the organization began in the year 1000. And I have several articles written, one in a Catholic magazine, the National Catholic Reporter, describing the use of the Knights of Malta. It is a group of people that are separated from the religious part of the church. The church has two functions, the Catholic Church. One, to save the souls and do whatever religion is supposed to do as a religion for the members of that church. The other is the military part, which began with the Roman Empire and became an organization in the year 1000 to go out and make war to convert the non-Catholics, all Gentiles, to the Church of Rome, and all Jews or non-believers also, to make the world under the Roman Empire, not just Christian, but Roman Empire. And I remember when I was growing up, all these stories about electing Smith and the first Catholic that was running for president, or Catholics being in office in the White House, and I thought this was just prejudice. I never studied it and never got into it until several years ago, until I extensively started research on two men in New York turned me on to this. And the people that are in the Knights of Malta call themselves the warrior monks, and they're a military vanguard. They have an office. They used to be out of Rome, and they're in Rome now because they lost their geographical territory years ago. They have 3 acres in Rome near the Vatican. They have their own coins, their own stamps, their own passport. They have diplomatic relations with 45 countries. They are considered a nation, but they take an oath to the Pope that he, above country, is the most important thing that they will serve. And they are the military, I say the vanguard. They have their own license plates, their own credentials, their own diplomatic corps, their own holidays, and that their specific goal when they are knighted is to continue the Church of Rome. Now, the Smithsonian Magazine in June of '82 has an article on these Knights of Malta, and they refer to them as prince and knights, and it says that not only is it a figure, it's not a figure of speech, that in order to be a Knight of Malta, they have to have an untainted nobility by some or all grandparents 200 years before their birth. They have to have noble birth 200 years before. So when I give you a list of people running our State Department, literally the State Department, the Defense Department, the Central Intelligence Agency, all branches of decision-making in our government, they're Knights of Malta.
Well, I'd like to ask a question here. When we wrote our Constitution, and we made the first American citizens out of the people that lived here, one of the prerequisites was to give up all titles. You could not have an English title. You couldn't be a von in German or a van in the Netherlands. You couldn't be the Earl of anything in England, and certainly that would preclude anybody
being... They have hidden their titles.
Okay.
They have hidden, because according to, and I have a lot of literature on the Smithsonian, it says, noble blood in itself is not enough. A knight must be a practicing Roman Catholic, and as a Catholic noble order, the knight owes his allegiance to the Pope. I've seen this over and over again, not to the president, not to anybody in the country. They are noble, going back 200 years before, say, if William Simon is a Knight of Malta, it's 200 years before he was born. If Alexander Haig is a Knight of Malta, or Reinhard Gehlen, who became Hitler's chief of intelligence and came to this country to form the CIA, we'll go through the who's who. They were knighted, and they swear at that ceremony that not country, not nation, it goes beyond nation and country, Rome, the Pope, is their allegiance.
Well, that's a question that has always been raised in politics in this country. The question when you talked about Al Smith back in 1928, the rebellion and Romanism had always been one of the things that people kept Catholics out of the mainstream of politics with.
Yeah, but you see, this thing sneaked in, like, say, William Wilson, who was in charge of Ronald Reagan's finances and his personal investments, and then became a controversial first ambassador over 100 years to Rome, is a Knight of Malta. Patrick Frawley, who from Schick Razor and Technicolor, and the ballpoint pen, the pen company, he had started that. He is a Knight of Malta. His wife is a Dame of Malta. Now, he took Ronald Reagan in Hollywood, introduced him to Henry Salvatore, and then Frawley brings in the anti-communist crusade with Mr. Fred Schwartz. But the point is that everybody around this current president is a knighted Malta with allegiance to Rome.
Well, I have another question. If this order started 1,000 years ago, or approximately 1000 AD, are these people must be very much pro-kings, for example?
Pro-monarchy. Well, see, that was one of the promises of Adolf Hitler. The Vatican had funded Pacelli. Cardinal Pacelli was in Rome and Munich, and there are books out, the Popessa and Roberta Calvi, God's Banker. He personally handed Adolf Hitler checks. All the Vatican hierarchy were knighted and around the Pope, and Hitler was funded. And one of the agreements was that after they conquered Russia, the Antichrist, they'd put the monarchies back on their thrones.
So that, in other words, what we're really saying that, as we were talking before, the Battle of Armageddon was supposed to take place during the Second World War.
Yes, that was. And you see, the point is that when it didn't happen, by 1943, when they realized that they hadn't put enough arms to take Hitler and Mussolini couldn't, particularly Hitler, couldn't take the Soviet Union, then by January 43, Adolf Hitler's men in the Vatican and SS Karl Wolff, the liaison between the Vatican and Himmler and Hitler, began making arrangements for the top Nazis to come to this country and be placed back in strategic positions. And they were linked to the Knights of Malta over 2 years, from 43 to 45, while the war was winding down. Now, as soon as the war was over, two of the most important members of the Rome desk became knighted before they began their counterintelligence. One was James Angleton, who was knighted by 1946 or 47, and Hitler's chief of intelligence, Reinhard Gehlen, was knighted by the Vatican. Now, you look at Dachau and Auschwitz and the deaths and what happened in World War II, and you look at all of that, and you take a man who's in charge of Hitler's intelligence, and the Vatican honors him, and his brother, Reinhard Gehlen's brother, was the top knight of the Vatican. So Hitler's intelligence was knighted, and the American intelligence, such as William Casey and James Angleton and our CIA, William Donovan, were Knights of Malta.
And the requirements to be a Knight of Malta, again, would be that 200 years ago, or within that realm, that long ago, that you had to be of royal blood, and you also had to be of the Catholic faith. Is that right?
That's exactly right. I'll read again. I have a lot of articles, but I brought just the Smithsonian, that they have 3 acres of territory, they issue coins and stamps and passports.
Well, we'll get back to the Knights of Malta after these messages. Welcome back to the KMFO Forum. Today we're talking about the Knights of Malta and how their worldwide organization affects the body politic all over the world. I'd like to add one other thing. If you'd like to join in our conversation, and we'd certainly like to hear from you, whatever idea you have concerning this, our numbers are 688-5804 or 475-5527, and we certainly would be glad to hear from you. As we go on this Knights of Malta thing, it sort of rings a bell with last Friday's special program concerning the Battle of Armageddon, where I had Barbara Honegger talking about that situation, or that point of view, or that frame of mind, I think is really what I'm talking about.
Yeah.
And really, with all these things, we're really talking about a point of view, a frame of mind. In other words, if such a thing is that I'd like to get back to monarchy and make everyone peasants again, that's a frame of mind.
That's part of it. That's right.
Okay, and if the other thing is I would like to create the Battle of Armageddon, that's a frame of mind, and it appears to me like this Knights of Malta is in that business also.
They all work together. I have an article from the New York Daily News when Alexander Haig was died as the Knight of Malta, and they told about a dinner party after St. Patrick's induction, and they go to the hotel in New York City, and at the time the Archbishop Pio Laga was the main speaker, but it said that J. Peter Grace got up there, and the newspaper says, and Grace gave a scathing attack against a nuclear freeze. They indicted Haig and 30 men approximately into the Knights of Malta last January in '83, and then they go to a lunch at the Waldorf, and the whole topic from the head of the Knights of Malta in the United States, which is J. Peter Grace, who's now telling the president to cut expenses by cutting Social Security income, not weapons, not the MX, and he is giving every one of those men. Now, Haig, his mentor in the Pentagon, who's retired but shares office with Daniel Graham, who is very much into this, Haig and Henry Kissinger, who are like blood brothers, make policies, and they are being told by the cardinals and archbishops.
Now you came into a nice name here.
Yeah.
A name that's going to be a household word given another 6 months. J. Peter Grace of the Grace Commission.
Absolutely.
Now let's talk about the Grace Industrial Empire. Grace's industrial empire makes such things as ships, construction equipment, construction products. They're out of Boston, Massachusetts.
The W.R. Grace, that's right.
Yeah, W.R. Grace. And J. Peter Grace, I assume, is the chief executive officer of W.R. Grace Corporation.
Yeah.
He has written 600 and some theses, almost like Martin Luther against the Catholic Church, against our body politic, saying that we cannot afford to do this, that, and the other thing. Among those things that he's written about are such programs as
taxing Social Security.
Social Security, but there's other ones that are even more interesting and more insidious. Let's talk about the insidious ones.
Okay.
Number one, to take away the deduction for home mortgage interest,
yes.
Especially on a second home. Take away the tax deduction on the taxes you pay on your mortgages. Take away almost every deduction that the middle-class American has had as a reason to buy and own his own home. Mm-hmm. Another example would be he wants to cut military pensions, even though they demand a big military, they never want to pay the piper.
Yeah, but okay, now you're telling what Grace is doing here. But in order for people to appreciate what he's doing to us while he simultaneously is pushing the weapons system to the max, you have to say, and this is where people fall back in this country, is to say, who is J. Peter Grace? The president has appointed him. Well, what's his background? Now, you may say he's W.R. Grace Shipping Company, but he isn't. He's chemicals, and he combined several years ago with Friedrich Flick, who was a defendant at Nuremberg, one of Hitler's top men. Flick bought like $593 million worth of W.R. Grace, and Flick ran extermination camps, slave labor with I.G. Farben. Grace is a partner of Otto Ambros of I.G. Farben, and over in Germany. Ambros was a defendant in Nuremberg. Ambros was the chemist who designed Zyklon B for Hitler, who learned how to get cheap labor by working people until they died. They put them in at Punamund at the missile factories. They brought them in. When they died, they brought in the next ones. You're talking about people that Auschwitz was, the location was decided by Ambros so that they could make synthetic rubber and fuel near a slave labor place where a river went by, and they figured out that you take the women, children, the defects, put them in an oven, take the workable people till they die. So what you're talking about, a man who works with Frederick Flick as his partner, Otto Ambros as his partner, who has had a history in 40 years in our lifetime of reducing the human person to a corpse, a literal animal, not taxing his home, taking his home and putting him into slave labor. That is the man who's making those changes, and he is in charge of the entire Knights of Malta in the United States.
That's Mr. Grace.
J. Peter Grace.
I've heard him on television. They've had him on a few talk shows, and I've heard this thing go on and on and on, and he's so adamant about the things that he wants to do, and everything seems to be so simplistic. In other words, I do this and that, and this will happen automatically. There's no complexity at all with the relationships, and immediately anybody that's simplistic I've listened to very carefully to see where he's coming from, and frankly, listening to him, he's coming from idiocity. But
he's not, but that's the cover. Now, see, J. Peter Grace was at Yale University a roommate with Pat Robertson. He started the Christian broadcasting system so that the religious right, even if Robertson isn't a Catholic, the Catholics funded, like Mr. Wyrick of the far right was funded by Coors to put in the other Christian right-wing movements, so that the Falwells and the Christian fundamentalists got their money from the Vatican to them.
That's the question I wanted to ask. Right there,
yes.
Coors. That's another.
Coors.
That's
Coors
another
the
name.
biggest name in the country. Now, in fact, I asked two researchers in the East who had given me the information on the Knights of Malta, Sovereign Military Order of Malta, several years ago. One of them just coincidentally called me this morning from New York. I said, I want the background Adolf Coors. I want to know if his money came from Otto Skorzeny and Hitler's fund out of Europe, where he started his money, because Coors is the head of the Heritage Foundation, and on it is William Simon of the Knights of Malta, and he has partners. There's another one who is on the board of I'm thinking of who is the Heritage, and there's two Knights of Malta and many more. But from the Vatican, this knighted nobility whose allegiance is to the Pope are appointed with Coors on the Heritage Foundation, and they make the policies also a lot for Ronald Reagan.
Well, let's get back to this now. We have a new right, which they consider themselves a moral majority, which would be usually at loggerheads with the Catholics, because that's always been, that particular Protestant ilk has always been anti-Catholic. Yes. We have a Catholic Church that for years blamed the Jews for the crucifixion of Jesus, who have since recanted from that in the last few years.
Not far.
I mean, they at least publicly recanted. We have that same situation, by the way, with that same moral majority concerning Jews. We have that same group supporting, it's really strange, really supporting the activities of the Zionists, which I don't know, speaking of Zionism, I don't know how the average run-of-the-mill Jew in this country would support him as much as these people do.
Well, you see, Zionism, again, was set up after James Angleton was knighted by the Pope. He went to Palestine to set up what became Israel. The Vatican set up Israel with Otto von Bolschwing. Otto von Bolschwing set it up. He was Eichmann's superior. He came to this country. He was in the OSS and the SS. I smoked him out with Pete Carey several years ago, living up in the Bay Area, and he put Helene von Damme for 8 years as Ronald Reagan's secretary, and she made the appointments in Washington until she became the ambassador in Vienna and went back to her hometown. So that Israel, the Zionism that Falwell's talking about, is the Zionism that James Angleton and the Vatican set up. But that, as he explains, is a temporary thing until your tribulation comes, and then it's got to go too. You know, it's only a temporary.
Well, the situation just concerning that, the anti-Semitic sort of arrangement that the Catholic and especially the fundamentalist Christians have had over the years, traditionally, all at once is pro-Zionist. And if you look at Zionism in itself, it's more a politic than it is a religion.
It's a military base for the Vatican and the United States. It isn't a Jewish homeland. It's only an allusion to a few people. But getting back to the Knights of Malta, the other person on the board, there's several with Coors, in the Heritage Foundation is Frank Shakespeare. Now, he's in charge of U.S. Information Agency. J. Peter Grace set up Radio Free America with Nazis after the war from the Romanian Iron Guard, and then Shakespeare moves in and takes the place. That was set up originally by J. Peter Grace. So the idea that a Knight of Malta in charge of that, who has employed with his partners, they've had this horrendous, you can't even call it slave labor, it's slave genocide, is deciding for America means that we can get to the same position someday as those people in Europe. If they want it, they did it in Europe. Why can't they do it here?
Well, I was hopefully. You see, that's just the problem I'm looking at. most of the time, we've always considered the United States to be a very pluralistic society, and we've allowed it to be that. In Europe, it never has been pluralism. Certainly the Swedes aren't pluralistic when everybody in town is blonde-haired and blue-eyed and everybody's a Lutheran, you see. The same thing holds true for Spain. Certainly they're not pluralistic. We are. We have Chinese, we have everything else. Yet we have an administration that was just elected that wants to change this pluralism to monoism, so that we don't have any pluralism anymore, that we have to all believe in the same things. It's almost gotten down to calling people that believe in abortion anti-American, people that don't believe in school prayer anti-American, people that don't believe in the blue laws in Philadelphia, we are also non-patriotic.
Well, you see, those simplistic things are what the way that Hitler got to power. He could solve the inflation, the unemployment, all the problems by very simple names and labels, and once people fell in them, he was home free.
Well, I understand that, and that's a real problem. Hitler was very easily done. They needed a scapegoat. They were going down the tubes. Here comes Adolf, who says, I'll straighten this problem out. Our problem is the Jews. They control all the money. The Rothschilds have the money. They're controlling us. They're making us poor. They're making us eat pumpernickel. By the way, the name of pumpernickel came. I wouldn't give you a nickel for a whole loaf of it. And they're making us go down the tubes and ruining our whole. But
they had it two ways. I was just mentioning to Barbara when we drove up here. They have it two ways. They can say the Jews have all the money, the Warburgs, the Rothschilds, and we said we've got to fight the communists because they're all Jews. They're giving it away and they're keeping it. You know, they're at both ends of the whipping post. You can have either way you like it. You can either say Jews are all communists, you know, Russian Revolution, and we'll get all the Jews. They're giving away our money, or you can say they have all the money.
Well, that's the situation was to be able to say that all the communists were Jews because Karl Marx happened to be Jewish.
That's right. And all the Jews are bankers because Rothschilds are bankers. I've never met a Jewish banker since.
Neither have I. I've never known
before.
one. No, it's usually run by somebody else. We'll be back with more on the Knights of Malta after these words from our sponsors. Welcome back to the KMFO Forum, where our guest this afternoon is May Brussell. Now, we're talking about the Knights of Malta, and I want to ask you a question. We named all these people. Now, probably the most famous Catholic in the United States were the Kennedys.
Yes.
Okay, were the Kennedys members of the Knights of Malta?
Joe Kennedy was a Knight of Malta.
The old man.
John Kennedy and Robert Kennedy never could be. They had their own ideas. You have to have total obedience to the Pope, and John and Robert and John Kennedy, no. That's one reason it'd be easy to kill them. And the Vatican also played a role with a lot, like James Angleton and Knights of Malta. Cabell, the mayor of Dallas, was a Knight of Malta. His brother was the deputy under Allen Dulles, a Knight of Malta. The Dallas scene, the people around Kennedy, that's how I caught on to the Knights of Malta, studying who killed Kennedy. Because a good part of the people in the Defense Department that had the allegiance to Rome, there was Patrice Lumumba, John 23rd, and John Kennedy that were all offed about the same time because of their social policies.
I see. So, in other words, the Knights of Malta tried to control countries by controlling the leadership, by disposing of those who, like writing little Nicaragua manuals like we just wrote, telling how to depose one of these people.
That's right. If you get rid of Allen Dulles and Mr. Cabell and the CIA, you know, and one's a Knight of Malta, and Allen Dulles' son, Avery Dulles, was a Knight of Malta, and he went to Europe to South America with Martin Bormann's son. And when you fire these people, and Allen Dulles, very close to the Vatican, William Donovan, a Knight of Malta, who formed the OSS, became the CIA, and incidentally, to bring up 2 points that are in the news today that make the Knight of Malta not way back when, but how it influences policy. Yesterday's New York Times, November 7th, has a story about this group of Catholics, a hierarchy, opposing the bishop's investigation. They're trying to show that there's poverty in the world, that you don't have to be a Marxist, and that you don't have to be part of the Reformation to know that there's an unequal distribution of wealth that causes hunger, that you don't have to be a socialist to want social change. So the bishops have been working on a report on capitalism, and the president asked it be delayed till after the election. And the day the election was over, the New York Times has a story countering these bishops, and the people on the commission that were hired or put together in May of this year to have the answers to when the report comes out or before it comes out were William Simon is on the commission, and he's a Knight of Malta, Alexander Haig, who's a Knight of Malta, Walter J. Hickel, the former, he was Interior Secretary in Alaska, is a Knight of Malta, J. Peter Grace is on the board, Peter Flanagan, who was in the White House with Nixon and worked with Haig and Kissinger and now works for Dillon Reed, which is the Brady family, Nicholas Brady, which are Knights of Malta. And the head of the New York Stock Exchange, there's Joe Hager, he's on this commission to put down the excuse for the unequal distribution of wealth. William Ellenhaus, Ellenghhaus, Ellenhaus, he's executive vice chairman of the New York Stock Exchange. So Flanagan and Grace and Ellenhaus and Hagen lose, and Hager and Simon and Flanagan are defending capitalism against those cruddy bishops who find that some people are hungry.
Well,
all night.
Well, the question I have to ask, they call the revolutionary priests
Yes.
in South America who see and try to minister to people.
That's
and
right.
It gives me great hope, you follow me, in organized religion, which I...
But he gave them hell. They came to Rome.
Well, I'm just pointing out, it gives me great faith to see that the fellow that's down there trying to minister to his peasant people is trying to help their lot. And when the Bishop of Rome comes out and says they're doing wrong,
that's right.
I wonder if he can really say that as Christ's vicar on earth.
Well, he said, because the Knights of Malta, you see, they think that if these priests go too far, the anti-Somoza people will stay in power. See, and they like Somoza there because he protects the wealth and doesn't divide it. And the Church of Rome wants those warriors not to divide up and have a socialist country, because, as Karl Marx said, religion is the opiate of the people. And if you throw out, if you divide capital, you may not need the religion. The religion is to let you know that if you have hell on earth, it'll be better somewhere else.
On the other hand, Karl Marx also said something that could come from the mouth of Jesus.
Yeah.
From each according to his ability, to each according to his need. Now, I don't really believe that because I'm too selfish to believe that personally.
Yeah.
But it certainly sounds like a Christian thing to say, that everyone is everybody else's keeper, and that's essentially what Karl Marx said.
Well, yeah, well, somebody could, if you didn't have a J. Peter Grace deciding for the President of the United States how to cut costs, he could say, with his education and abilities in this country, that instead of the MX missile, I will build so many shelters for homeless in the country, and we would never feel the loss of the money. We wouldn't be less able to defend ourselves, and we'd be a better people. But he has sworn that the people, this is hard to understand, but people don't mean anything to this gang. They really don't mean much.
Well, as you pointed out before, most of the ilk came from the Hitler regime, or used people only as tools to accomplish an end.
And almost every one of these has a link going back to Adolf Hitler. That's right.
Okay, and probably before that they went to other people of not much better situation.
Yeah, incidentally, yesterday's paper had a story, Leslie Geld from the New York Times, will Reagan name an arms czar, somebody to control weapons. And it tells about Caspar Weinberger, and considering, I don't like the word czar, and his top aide, Richard Pearl. Well, Richard Pearl's Bible is a Professor Gita, who's a Knight of Malta from Stanford, who puts down the Protestant angst, the Reformation, the idea that people need things. So that while Caspar Weinberger isn't knighted, he and his advisor used the books from Stanford, from Gita, from Rome, to make their policy.
Well, you know, another interesting thing is they always misquote the administration, the Protestant ethic.
Yes.
The Protestant ethic, as opposed to the Catholic ethic, was the fact that you could invest money for return. Had nothing to do with people working. It said, you remember Shakespeare's famous Shylock, who lent money, and the only reason he was the money lender is because Christians couldn't lend money without committing a sin, so they let Shylock lend the money. And all that Martin Luther said was, well, why aren't we all investing capital? Why aren't we making capitalism? So, as the first real capitalist, as opposed to monarchist, there sat Martin Luther, who taught economics in the university.
Yes.
And it's an interesting thing that they came up that the Protestant ethic was that everybody works, and that isn't at all what it was. It's that you can invest and make money, make a return on your money. And we'll be back after these words from our sponsor. Observation. Maybe this observation isn't right, but Catholic countries in the world seem to be the struggling nations that don't have a viable economy. For example, Spain and Portugal and Italy.
But the Vatican was one of the richest organizations in the world. They bought the territory in the town, the real estate.
Well,
the people themselves are poor.
Okay, South America, Central America, the Philippines, and all the countries that have been touched therein.
North Vietnam even was a lot Catholic. Vietnam
was very Catholic, especially South. But North Vietnam was also. But I'm just pointing out, these countries have never seemed to make it. And was it because of the fact that it was sinful to capitalize? And I've always wondered that. Or could the right person capitalize? So that situation has come up in recent years, looking at the economic growth of Northern Europe versus the rest of Europe. And you can see there's a tremendous variance in the two growth.
Well, I don't think the church encouraged people to do it. I think they didn't want to compete with people who had capital. They wanted the people with capital to join the churches, but I don't think it was a kind of church that encouraged the poor person. Certainly, they have not put any in the third world areas, any kind of agriculture industrialization. All they've done with these poor nations is to go into debt. They've not encouraged them to be on their own.
Well, getting back to Shakespeare and looking at the character of Shylock, which I think is an interesting character because all he wanted was his money back.
Yeah.
You know, the promise. And everybody in that town in Italy said, well, you don't really get your money back because you're a lousy Jew and you lend money and that's a terrible thing to do. And so Portia comes out and gives him a knife and says, you want your pound of flesh.
Yeah.
And at this point, I look at that thing, you know, from understanding that a writer is going to write about the times he lives in, and that was really the attitude. In other words, today, what would happen if you didn't pay the mortgage company the payment for your house? They wouldn't give him a pound of flesh, they'd give him your damn house, like they always have, time immemorial. And we're looking at this situation back in Shakespeare's time, and we're seeing the same thing these days. Now,
you remember the tremendous debts now are in Poland and with Brazil and Argentina and Mexico, all Catholic countries where we've literally owned them and made them incur these tremendous debts. They didn't receive anything for the money. We haven't received anything for the money. The people haven't seen a cent of it. Where did the debts that are going to break the American banks? We emptied the flight capital out of this country, sent it down there to the hands of some people that we don't know. It certainly wasn't distributed in any form.
There's a lot of people that are hoping that the money they sent down there was the money that the Arabs invested over here, you know, getting a little of our oil money back. But that doesn't answer the problem.
No.
We have banks in trouble, and that's pretty obvious.
And banks in trouble. And the flight capital has gone to areas that are predominantly Catholic who have not invested into the people.
Okay, let's talk about now, we have seen that this administration, or the past one, and we're going to have the same thing again, that's what the man said the day before yesterday. Let's just talk about the influence now of the new right, which is the born-again Christian right, the Jerry Falwell ilk, and the Knights of Malta, which he's surrounded by. It looks to me like that's all he's surrounded by is that point of view.
Well, see, when you get people like William Simon on the board of Helionetics, co-working with Edward Taylor and Daniel Graham for the Star Wars, Space War, and the Armageddon psychology that the whole Defense Department hates, and you get Knights of Malta and others among those on the board who are very influential, Patrick Frawley, a Knight of Malta who put in Ronald Reagan's original career, introduced him to Mr. Salvatore, who was originally from Italy, the Steel Man, and you have him surrounded with the fundamentalists who have the Armageddon philosophy, and then the intelligence community, the William Caseys of the Knights of Malta, William Buckley, James Buckley, Vernon Walters, coup after coup, you know, throwing military dictatorships into power, squeezing the people's rights, and giving them the only, the religious philosophy that goes with it.
Well, let's get into another one that just happened. You know, just talking about one that's about ready to blow up. We went down, put CIA money in to protect the ITT in Chile to get Pinochet in.
And John McCone's a Knight of Malta.
Okay.
He was on the chairman of ITT.
Let's see what's happening today. Okay, today they've declared a special state of emergency, closed down practically every newspaper or publication that is against their administration, and we, I guess, and it's admitted, I don't think it's anybody's, no question about it, we paid for the assassination of Allende, and we paid for the...
And Vernon Walters was there with the overthrow in Brazil in 1964, and they were in Dallas. These coups, now this is the crux of the whole point of bringing up this subject right now, at least for me, to share with you and the listeners, is that a handful of people from, say, Pat Robertson, Falwell, being funded by Wyrick, a Catholic, J. Peter Grace, a Catholic, the Catholics, putting the money into the Protestant hands to get them started. Incidentally, that glass church of, what's his name down in Los Angeles, the Crystal Theater, the architect Johnson was a Nazi for Adolf Hitler, and J. Peter Grace was just down there about 3 Sundays ago giving the services, the Christian Protestant and the Catholic. The thing that we've done...
Well, he's in a little trouble, you know.
Yeah, but what we have done is decimated all the countries we've gone into, because a handful of people, and this pertains to America now with Grace's Commission, a handful of people thinking that God has given them these orders and that they have got this military power and this oath, have ruined, literally bankrupt and ruined this country, will ruin our savings. They've ruined Chile. They've ruined Brazil in terms of ever getting over a dictatorship, or Uruguay or Paraguay. And where we put in these dictatorships, we're going to decimate Central America. And even if it's a parking lot, or Southeast Asia, Laos, Cambodia, Vietnam, these people have not been successful in Lebanon, in Iraq, in putting in the Shah. The same Knights of Malta put in the Shah. We have ruined the planet, and the same people keep getting the same appointments to go to the next country. And a handful of people, whatever country I dissect, it's the same people, and they have the same links to this sovereign military. And once we extricate them, I think we would be through 50% of our problems.
Well, the question comes down to another thing. Let's talk about it. It comes down to a real confrontation between communism and the rest of the world. Now, one of the famous things that Mr. Reagan would like to go on all the time and say is, I'd rather be dead than red.
Then why does he recognize Red China? They want them atomic weapons.
No, okay, now that doesn't make any difference, but rather be dead than red, May.
Yes.
Let me point something out.
Yes.
That isn't my point of view.
No, it's not yours. And you see, the inconsistency is that he had George Bush as the ambassador to China, and Bush becomes the CIA director. How come they want to give China satellites and technology for atomic weapons? What is better dead than red? What do they have in mind if they recognize China, why we can't live with Russia?
Well, I don't know. Why haven't we had any, any intercourse with Russia concerning some type of arms agreement?
See, I think our Pentagon, with the Vatican and the intelligence community, has a fetish with the Church of Rome, and that they can take China later, but they absolutely cannot sleep. You know, William Donovan fought in World War I. I was mentioning this driving up here. He fought in World War I and met with J.P. Morgan by 1920 and had $2 billion to begin starting World War II and funding Hitler. $2 billion.
We'll be back.
Yeah.
After these messages from our sponsor. Welcome back to KMFO's Forum. We have with us today May Brussell, and we're talking about the Knights of Malta. You can call us on 688-5804 or 475-5527 to join in our conversation. May can be heard on, Sunday nights? Monday nights, 9 to 10 on KKUP, and on 8 to 9 on Mondays at KAZU out of Carmel. You've talked about many, many subjects, and probably this one is probably the most current, this Knights of Malta
It's connection. The most important.
Yes.
It's the most important.
We've heard of such things as the Club of Rome, for example, and the Trilateral Commission. Is there any connection between Knights of Malta, say, and those other two?
Well, they are. Maybe I have a list of a few, not all of them, just a few of the prominent Knights of Malta that affect us today. Maybe we run down the names. You would see how, like, we're getting to the Club of Joseph Bettinger, who, with Prince Bernhard, founded the Bilderbergers. Now, they're part of the Prince Bernhard, with the Lockheed scandals and so forth. He was a member of Hitler's SS. He married Queen Juliana. And he is the knighted by the Vatican, Bettinger, formed the Bilderbergers. So people worry about the Council of Foreign Relations, but they never talk about the members of the Vatican whose oath is to Rome, the 200 years of nobility. So Robert Albanap, the man that put in Richard Nixon's homes, provided his shelter in the Bahamas, flew him down there, long friend, buys Julie's home, very much part of the Nixon career, and the Watergate story, Albanap's a Knight of Malta. William Buckley, who founded Young Americans for Freedom. The Campus Crusade, run by Joseph Coors and the Hunt family, and they brought in the Young Americans from Freedom from Munich, Germany, to Dallas at the time of the Kennedy assassination. That's where I first got on the Knights of Malta. William Buckley and his partner who formed it, Douglas Caddy, it was his office of Mullen and Company that was the house of E. Howard Hunt and the Watergate spying for the CIA. James Buckley, a Knight of Malta, the roving ambassador of the president. Now, William Casey, who makes these decisions, the death squads and who should be killed, who lives and dies in what countries.
And the famous manual that just went down.
That's right. Wild Bill Donovan, who died a few years ago from the OSS.
He was the OSS,
right. He was active with the Knights of Malta and worked with the Tsarist Russians to try to overthrow Russia from 1919 on. Peter Domenici, the Democrat from New Mexico, is a Knight of Malta. You don't think of it. He's on the Committee for Internal Security and Terrorism now with his oath, 200 years going back to Rome, to the Vatican. Peter Flanagan, I mentioned, Reinhard Gehlen was knighted. Hitler's chief of intelligence who set up the CIA. Patrick Frawley, the man that discovered Ronald Reagan, a Knight of Malta. Baron Hilton, the Hilton family at the hotel chain. Alexander Haig. Lee Iacocca, who worked for Ford Motor for many years, and Ford Motor was making cars and trucks during Nazi Germany time and funding Hitler and the Protocols of Zion. He worked Iacocca for many years with Ford, and then went to Chrysler, but he worked for Henry Ford through his virulent
and very, very successful at Chrysler.
Very successful. Joseph Kennedy, James Ling, the corporation with the computers, Knight of Malta, Claire and Henry Luce. John McCone, director of the CIA when John Kennedy was murdered, chairman of ITT. Dr. Robert Morris, he was a judge president of the university in Dallas, University of Dallas. He works between Princeton and Dallas. In the 60s, he brought over men working with General Walker that formed the basis of the campus crusade that got Reagan in today.
Was Walker a knight?
No. No aristocracy in Walker.
Well, Walker, I mean, he was...
John Merseyside, no, he was not. He was not a nobleman.
Okay, well, Walker was such an abomination in Europe that
But they use these Walkers. See, we think of the ancient... See, Father Coughlin and those people, Smith, H.L. Smith, what was the name of the old anti-Semite? Yeah. They were brought in by the Grace family. See, and people like George de Mohrenschildt, who supplied Oswald's money and homes and jobs, he worked for J. Peter Grace before he came to this country, and he was wanted as a war suspect spy during the war. The people that I call the street schleppers from the intelligence community are used by the higher-ups, but the higher-ups are the knights. John McCone, Robert Morris, Robert Milliken, if you see these new ads of Visa Fabric on the television, they're running them all the time now. Milliken is on the board with J. Peter Grace, a Knight of Malta. He gave John Reese several $100,000 or more to form Western Goals that you'll be hearing about in the news, the lawsuit of the people that have been spied upon by Larry McDonald. Larry McDonald was chairman of Western Goals. When he was Deep Six, he was also head of the Birch Society, working with Lamar and Bunker Hunt. So the Protestant bishops work with the Knights of Malta, funded by the Knights of Malta.
We have a call here. Let's just check in. You're on the air. Hello?
Hello. I had a question about the Council on Foreign Relations and the Rockefeller connection, in connection with this Knights of Malta.
Well, the Rockefellers began bringing British intelligence, William Stevenson, into and incorporating British intelligence during the war, because the OSS was fairly new and British intelligence had been going on for a couple 100 years.
And much more superior to ours.
More superior to ours, the MI1, 5, and 6. So William Stevenson incorporated with Rockefeller, used Rockefeller Center during the war, set up headquarters down at Montego Bay for Ian Fleming and the original daddy of James Bond. And what they did was they used many of the Knights of Malta and brought them over. Rockefeller incorporated into the intelligence community people like, well, Mr. Donovan was very much a part of a Knight of Malta, brought James Angleton, brought Reinhard Galen, and brought to this country after the war the people that were swearing their oath of allegiance to Rome, so that while the Rockefellers were Protestant. See, here's the thing. You take the international bankers like the Rockefellers, the Morgans, and the Astors, and that hierarchy is not Catholic, but they need an army to protect their investments. So they would choose the people to go out and form our Pentagon, State Department policies that were knighted to keep them secure that their banks and stock market would roll along.
I think we lost our caller. Are you still there? I think hopefully we answered the question.
Yeah.
You know, that's an interesting thing, because back east when I was a kid, you know, being a Catholic wasn't the top part of being in the top part of aristocracy. You had to be an Episcopalian.
That's right. High Episcopalian.
And we're looking at Mr. Rockefeller, who was a fit Episcopalian. We're looking at the rest of the Episcopalian hierarchy.
Yes.
And this Episcopalianism, or Church of England, or Anglicanism, or whatever you want to call it, was very, very successful in electing presidents, for example.
And very snobbish. That's
and very, very snobbish. President Roosevelt was an Episcopalian, and it used to be a laugh that if you really wanted to be in high society, it darn sure had to be an Episcopalian. And it looks to me now that in order to be in high society, you have to be a member of the Knights of Malta.
Well, see, what happened was that the Episcopalians put the weapons and the techniques into the hands of those warriors who would protect their investment, so that eventually they became independent on their own.
I see. And this was a very interesting
So that you see, Rockefeller can be deep sixth and be dead at the time of the election.
Well, thank you, May Brussell. Next week, we're going to talk about the Dalcon Shield with a representative of the firm of Melvin Belli, who is working on that case right now. And we hope you've enjoyed our program. I'd like to thank our producer, Jamila Amin. This is John Arlen, and this has been the KMFO Forum.
So I dropped into the luxury of the lords, fighting dragons and crossing swords.
Now you owe me one. And if you don't pay me when you owe me, then I'm going to pay you what you owe me. You see what I'm saying?